Right, so I'm Professor Michael Terry. I'm at the University of Waterloo, and I'm going to be talking about some of the work that we've done here. The primary portion of my talk, I'm going to be talking about work we've done redesigning license agreements, which I know you're all really enthused about. And this was work that was done with Matthew Kay, who's sitting back there. So, okay. So to begin with, first things first. So Patrick, you're here. Joanne, I assume she's not here because there's only one female in the audience. I already met her. And then Rob Kroger, not here either. Celine says hi. All right. So she told me to say hi to you guys.
We sneak it in.
Very subtle. So I'm going to give you, in this talk, I'm going to give you an overview of the work we do at the HCI lab. And then I'm going to get into this topic of license agreements. And so the goal here is to show you how to put the fun back into dry legal agreements, because they were fun to begin with at some point, I'm sure. So HCI at the University of Waterloo includes myself and Edward Lank. So we co-direct the HCI lab. We have a postdoc, Andrea Bunt, and then a number of really talented grad students whose pictures you can see here. And you can see us on the web at hci.uwaterloo.ca. Okay, so to give you a quick explanation of the type of work we do here at the HCI lab, the best way to characterize it is needs-driven design. So we identify people's needs, users' needs, by studying them. So that's the top part of the triangle right there. And so we use methods like contextual design, grounded theory, interviews, on-site observations to understand how people use technology, and then use that to drive the design of new technology. And then where possible, we like to deploy it, put it out there in the world, and have people actually use it, because I think you learn a lot when you actually put the technology out there for people to use on a day-to-day basis. So some examples of work that we've done where we published recently, we studied the gaming practices of the Nintendo DS. So you may not be aware of it, but there's one Nintendo DS for every 100 people in the world. And so with that type of penetration, you start to wonder, okay, how does its feature set affect the gaming practices? And so we did a qualitative study, found out a lot of really interesting aspects of gaming with the DS. We've also recently studied the work practices of mathematicians, so tablet computers, so pen-based computing. One of the attractive, motivating scenarios for using these tablet PCs is as a very natural input method for mathematicians. And so people are trying to create pen-based interfaces to things like Maple and Mathematica, but they don't really know how mathematicians work. So we went out there and studied mathematicians to help drive the design of future pen-based interfaces to mathematical systems. The primary work that I deal with is open source software, and specifically looking at how we can introduce usability in a more principled way into the practices of open source developers. And I'll touch upon that in a bit. But first, what I want to do is give you an example of two representative projects. One is Kinematic templates, and the other is AwkChecker. Both of these were done by master students of mine, so one by Richard Fung and the other by Terry Park. So, Kinematic templates. So we observed how artists work, okay? And there's this one important result that came out of it that had a lot of significant implications. And it's kind of obvious. When people color, paint, or draw, they tend to stay within the lines, right? In itself, not too groundbreaking. But if you dig a bit deeper, you realize that they stay in the lines by selectively varying their motor control. Okay, so when they're defining lines, they have very precise, slow movements. When they're shading, then they're very coarse with their movements, and so they have, they have much less care and attention paid to their movements. But as they approach the areas of detail or lines, they start to slow down. Okay, so there arise over time portions of the composition where they're always going to be slow with their movements, right? So the question was, could we actually make use of that and create drawing aids for them? And we did. So I need a volunteer to come on up, because you're actually going to try out some software. All right, there you go. Thanks, Andrew. Come on up. So this is like are you Joanne, by the way?
Yeah.
So I'm supposed to say hi to you from Celine. You missed the slide.
I heard about that. And I've heard the talk about that's why I'm late, but somebody messaged me saying next week that slides are running out of
Oh, great. Thanks whoever conveyed that.
Yeah.
It's all right.
My
You
fault
just,
being late.
yep, you got a late pass. That's all right. So this is kind of like an infomercial. Have you ever tried to draw on a laptop where you have to use like a trackpad or a track point or a mouse, and the results just weren't that great?
Yes.
Yes, see? And this is not prearranged. All right? So what you're going to do is try out a system. I'm going to get rid of my taskbar here, which is kind of light, actually. What I'd like to ask you to do is to try drawing a circle in this blank space over here. Okay? Go for it.
Just click and drag.
Click and drag. Nice. Great. Now I'd like you to do it in that space up there around the center of the circle. So your circles are so bad to begin with. It's only marginally better. And so what I'm going to do is give you a little bit more help. Now try it.
Feel good about this one.
You feel good about it?
Oh no. Nice oval.
Yeah. Good. All right. So hold on. Now what I'm going to do is throw another template up here for you. Okay. Now try to draw a diagonal line. Start outside and then try to go through that. So like at a 45-degree angle. So what do you feel happening once you hit it?
Oh, it breaks my mouse.
Now try drawing a straight line across. The best output yet. Very good. Thanks. Give him a round of applause. All right. So what these templates are doing, if it's not immediately obvious, it's they influence your movement. And so these right here. So if I were to draw a circle. I honestly don't know what your issue was. But if I try to draw a circle right there at the same speed and it's care, it's much worse. So you can see there's a big difference there. So the tool is obviously helping you out, most users. So this right here, so those right there were passive templates. This right here is a different type of template. This is an active template. I'm just going to click the button. And you'll see right there it starts drawing a circle. So it's actually inducing motion on the cursor. I'm going to grab another template, the magnetic point template. Just throw it on there. I'm going to reduce the strength of it to about 25%. Move this one out of the way. And so now if I click the mouse and hold it, then you see it pulled into the center. So if I take this one right here and overlay it, you can probably guess what's going to happen. So you can combine these things together. If we take that first template, one of the first templates, the hatching template, and we'll expand it, and we will increase the strength a bit, place it over there, and then we draw with it. You can see it's influencing it so that it's actually squashing the spiral. So you can play with the strength there, dial it down a bit, and you'll have even tighter, or you'll have more of a spiral right there, so you can see it's being squashed. So these are kinematic templates. They influence the cursor as you're using the software. And they really, again, drove out of this observation that people tend to vary their motor movements when they're drawing. And so can we allow them to encode the types of influences that they want to have on their motor movement within the composition itself? Just really quickly, the implementation, we get the delta x and delta y between the cursor movements, and then we can scale that or add constants to it to achieve those effects. So it's fairly simple at the lowest level. But when you put it in the hands of an artist, you can get some impressive results. So on the left right there, you see the raw input where we're reading off the tablet, and then on the right, you see the output that the user's seeing as they're using the templates. So you can see right there that it cleans up the output significantly, but it retains the human element. So one of the big goals of this work was, can we preserve the human element, but improve the person's output in the moment? Here's another example. So in this case, again, you can see a lot of the lines are cleaned up with the output from the kinematic templates. Now note that they're doing things like hatching and shading and so on, using both straight lines but also curves, and it's actually quite simple to do with our tools. So if you're interested in this work and you want to see more examples of what it can do and read more about it, I encourage you to go to our website. The second quick demo is AwkChecker. So non-native speakers make a class of errors that are not made by native speakers. Okay? So if you're Korean, you might ask, is the sky pure today? And really what you're asking is the sky clear today? Now if you type this phrase into Microsoft Word, it's not going to flag it as being incorrect. It's grammatically correct, but it's just not said. This is not the convention in English to ask, is the sky clear today? And there are a number of these types of errors that people make. They're called collocation errors. Okay? Now, we built a tool. Like I said, if you throw this into Word, you're not going to get these errors flagged. And again, it's because they're grammatically correct. You can spell them correctly and so on. And so what we did is we built a tool to detect these types of errors and to offer suggestions. So I got to do a quick switch to show this video. All right. Cursor. There we go. Okay. So what you're going to see is that the person is using Wikipedia as a backing corpus. I'll talk about that in a second. And then he's typing in phrases, so name it a day. I had some powerful tea. You can see right there the system's working in the background, and it finds that these are awkward phrases in the English language, and it's flagging them. Okay? You can click on one. You can get suggested alternatives, including examples of context of use. And so this is where Wikipedia comes in. It's checking how often are these types of phrases found in Wikipedia. And if it's not commonly found, it's saying, okay, there's probably an error here. And then it's developing suggested alternatives along with examples. And so if you're a non-native speaker, you can look at the phrases and then also look at the examples to say, is this the particular phrase I'm looking for? So again, this is work done by Terry Park, and it's really motivated on looking at how non-native speakers speak and then the class of errors that they make. Okay, so very quickly, again, we're taking a corpus-driven approach. So we create an n-gram dictionary of common phrases, and then we use that to find awkward phrases. And there are a couple of really nice features of using this approach. First of all, it's generalizable to any language, right? So you don't have to build rules. All you're doing is looking at frequency of use. You can also select a particular corpus to achieve a particular writing style. So if you need to write a paper for a medical journal and you're inexperienced in writing papers for that medical field, if you have a corpus of medical papers, then you can use that as your backing corpus and help you write language that's more common or typical for that field. So for example, you might be writing and you say, well, you know, the patient had stitches, but maybe they use sutures more commonly. So the tool will help flag those types of errors. And then, again, by using a corpus, we have this nice advantage that as the language evolves, as long as our corpus evolves, then the AwkChecker will evolve with language. So again, if you're interested in this particular piece of technology, I point you to our website where we have a paper and some videos on it. Okay, so my primary focus, as I mentioned, is usability in open source software. And the motivating research question is, how can we enable open source software developers to produce more usable software? Okay, so they've proven without a doubt that they can make high quality server class software. The question is, how can they make software that's more usable by your normal day-to-day user? So we started this project called ingimp. So we took GIMP, which is like the Photoshop equivalent, open source equivalent to Photoshop. We instrumented it to collect data about how it's used in practice. Okay? Open source software developers get information through mailing lists, through bug reports, but they don't really know how their software is used in practice. And this is important to be able to drive design forward. So we instrumented GIMP. All the data we collect is made publicly available, which makes it the first public corpus of application usage data over the long term. And we've been doing this for over 2 years now. So all the data and more project information is available at ingimp.org. Now, as I mentioned, all the data we collect is publicly available. So there are some small privacy risks. Okay? We know what these are, and so we have this consent agreement which describes how you might be at risk at using our software. And you can see right there, there's our privacy agreement. But how many people actually read these things? So how many people read license agreements when you install software? Wow, typically, okay, I have at least a kind of, right? Typically, there's at least one person who said, but this really surprised me. So no one here reads license agreements ever. Great. So let me give you some stats. You kind of match the real world. So less than 2% of the population is estimated to read these things. And so we actually, since we're at Google, we looked at some of your materials that you have online. And so you have a number of privacy videos for different products. And so for OrCID, the YouTube video for the privacy aspects of OrCID had about 400,000 views, and there's estimated to be about 30 million users. Right? So we're still at the less than 2% figure. And then 84,000 views for the web history privacy video out of how many millions of users of Google Apps. I don't know. You have those numbers, but this is likely far less than 1%. Right? So people aren't reading these things, right? And I always get this question, well, do companies actually want their users to read these things? So, again, I'm at Google. You have a web page. You have a privacy center where you're trying to communicate this information to your users. Okay? So the question is, how effective is this? But you're really not the only example, right? You're a good example of a company that has the user's best interest in mind, but there are other companies who are interested in doing this kind of stuff. So Aviary, for example, is an online web application, and they have this license agreement they have with a summary of the agreement terms on the right. And recently this has gotten some attention on Dig. So we're interested in improving agreements so that people are more likely to read them. And again, I think we can make an argument that some companies do want to have their users understand their service agreements. Another area of business that's concerned with this is insurance companies. So if they can present their clients, potential clients, an agreement that's easy to understand, it's a marketing advantage for them. Or they can say, come to us, you can read and fully comprehend and easily understand our terms of agreement. But obviously there are some people who don't want you to read them. So spyware is an example, right? So for some spyware applications, it takes literally hours to read all the documentation associated with their license agreement. But we've also talked to lawyers about this. And so lawyers don't want to be in a situation where they're in court, where someone's contesting the terms of the agreement, and the person's saying, I didn't read this, right? I spent no time, and I didn't notice it or whatever. They don't want to be caught in that situation. Even though the U.S. courts have typically upheld that the agreement is still binding, they still don't want to be in that situation. So the question is, how can we improve this? So to give you an outline of where I'm going with the rest of the talk, I'm going to first discuss some problems with the agreement. So why are these ineffective? Talk about some goals for redesign, explore the design space of potential solutions, and then I'm going to introduce our particular solution called textured agreements. We ran an experimental study. I'll convey those results, and I'll conclude with some future work. So what issues do we have? Well, we have this ineffective presentation of information. So right here, this is the iTunes agreement. And you can see right off the bat, it's all bold. It's all caps at the top, right? All caps text is much more difficult to read because you can't see the word forms. And so it's just this wall of text, right? There's no real visual design that's gone into the presentation of that content. But these things also have very little personal relevance, okay? And the person has little agency in the entire transaction, right? This is legalese where the company is trying to impose limitations and terms and policies on the user, but it's not like it's being conveyed as it's in their best interest to understand these things, right? They're fulfilling a legal obligation. But at the same time, it's a one-sided negotiation, right? You either agree to these terms or you disagree and use something else, right? And so it's blocking you. You're trying to get a task done, but it's popping up this legal agreement that you have to agree to continue on with your task. But we also see tons of these things, right? And so over time, we become desensitized to them, and we just get used to clicking I accept and next without reading them. So these are all issues that are motivating people just to simply ignore these agreements. So if we take those issues and we turn around, we can say what our goals, we can synthesize a set of goals for redesigning the agreements. So first of all, we want to compel people to actually read these things. We want to get their attention and then demonstrate that it's actually worth their time to read these agreements. We also want to effectively present the information in a way that aids comprehension, right? So we want to get rid of these walls of text that are not inviting you to poke around and see what the document's all about. And finally, we want to be robust to desensitization and habituation, right? If you encounter these often and frequently, right, you should be compelled to read them every time you see them, in the ideal sense. So how could we address these? What are some possible ways we could address this problem? Well, we could redesign the consent process, redesign the agreement process itself. So we could require the user to scroll down to the end before they clicked accept. Now, this is sometimes used, and actually we think there are some real issues with this, but I'll wait till a bit later to discuss that. You could do things like rearrange the buttons so every time you look at it, the buttons are in a different location, which makes you stop and consider the content. And we've had some lawyers suggest that maybe you need to have like these comprehension quizzes where people have to fill out, answer questions where they're reading the agreement before they can proceed. And we don't think that's a good approach either. One approach that's been advocated is to have a one-page summary of the content. And we'll talk about that. We actually studied that particular condition. Now, you could also augment these agreements with additional compelling media. So you could have video, animation, you could have comics. So, for example, Scott, what's his name, who did the comics? Is it Scott McCloud? I'm trying to remember. So you guys had a rollout of a product, and you had comic strip narrative. Anyway, so you could have like a high-profile comic artist come in and design something for you. So that's another option. And then you could, investigate actually visually redesigning the agreements themselves, and this is the approach that we took. But before we got there, we explored this design space. So we engaged in rapid iterative prototyping of different possibilities, and we continually evaluated these designs with think alouds and redesigns on the spot. So we had paper prototypes, brought people in, and then redesign when the prototypes failed. We had 21 subjects in this particular phase. So this is what our lab looked like in that particular phase of the project. So completely covered with paper and sketches. We'd bring people in, show them a sketch, see what they understood and didn't understand about it, and then redesign right there on the spot. We tried things like video. We tried wordless diagrams because we wanted to explore the possibility of creating diagrams that didn't have to be localized. We explored text with illustrations, lots of different alternatives. And so you can see some of the examples here. So not only redesigns of the agreement, but also some redesigns of the interaction, potential interaction design. So there's a video where we have some summaries of the type of content that's on there. So lots of different possibilities. So the result, people ignored all of them, right? Once they found out that they could skip through it, like if we showed video, once they figured out that they could just, scroll to the end and skip through it, then they did that, right? So these things didn't seem to be working too well. But we did learn something. So people did respond when we took time to visually redesign the agreement. Okay, so they felt like we were making an effort to try to actually communicate to them, right? That we were trying to have this back and forth communication. So, what did we do? We turned to some experts in visual design. So, we turned to trashy magazines. Why? Because they're financially motivated to grab your attention, right? And the supermarket checkout counter or checkout line, they're there trying to get your attention, right? So we got copies of Star Magazine, Us Weekly, Glamour, GQ, Time, National Geographic, and no, I'm not a subscriber to Glamour or Star or anything like that. We had to actually buy these things, but we, charged them to the university. And then we systematically went through them and identified and labeled all the different techniques they use to get your attention. So this then became our wall in our lab. So you can see all these tear-outs of the magazines. You can see Post-it notes on them. If we go in closer, you can see we're annotating them. So for example, on the right there, we have a Post-it note on the sheet, but also a label indicating the convention that's being used. So right here, they have a bunch of different authors offering an opinion, and they have a little picture of themselves right next to the portion of text, that they wrote, right? So it makes it more personal. It's like you're actually communicating with the author. So we took all these techniques, and we clustered them together to come up with this toolkit you could think of visual design techniques. Now, I should mention one thing. So there were two of us, two males, going through this. After 4 hours, we would still stop and read content in these magazines, even though we're not the target demographic for most of them. Right? We're not young women in their late teens and early 20s. And so the fact that they still got our attention seemed to indicate that there was value in these techniques. So we started out with a consent agreement that looked like this, and then we redesigned it to make it look like this. So this is our textured agreement. So there are a number of different techniques that we use to construct this. First of all, we employ information layering. Okay, this is a technique that's common in graphic design. In fact, none of these techniques are novel, right? I mean, we drew them right from magazines. Their application, though, to this domain is novel. So you can see right here we use white space to create easily identifiable sections. We have clearly defined headings. We have things like bullet points. We have things like bold text. And so the information is layered so that you can skim it, you can find content, you can get an overview of it by looking at the headings and so on. We also use what we call factoids, which are seen as pull quotes in other contexts. So you can see right there on the right, we have some stats, right, some numbers related to the content of the agreement. We have this quote right there off to the right, which talks about content in the agreement itself. And so these are really bite-sized information nuggets where it can pull you in and make you feel like, hey, it's probably not that much of a chore to read these things. There's some interesting tidbits that I can quickly consume. We also have vignettes. So on the bottom right, you see this little comic strip right here, and it's saying, hey, we collect command names. Right? So it's talking about how the application's instrumented. Okay? And so these are much more personable. They're empathetic to the end user, right? So you're essentially projecting the end user into the comic strip, again, to indicate that, yes, we're trying to communicate to you, and we have your best interests in mind. We also employ sensationalism. So, for example, on the top right, it says, this software collects what? And so it's actually quite easy to add sensationalism to these agreements when you read the terms of them, because some of them are rather draconian. And so all you have to do is just point that out, make these screaming type headlines, and it's fairly easy to employ this technique. And then finally, we have visual variety. So there are a number of techniques we employ, but we vary the use of the techniques throughout the agreement, so there's always something new to look at. Right? So it's trying to pull the person through by compelling them to ask what is coming up next. So right there you see this is our latest design. You can see right here two different applications of the technique. So on the left is a moderate application of the techniques, and then on the right is just this over-the-top application where it makes it look more like glamour. And this was intentional. We really wanted to push the design space, to see how far we could go with these techniques. So the one on the right, very dense, very visually dense, has a little puppy there who's pleading with you. We have, someone that looks like the main figure in the screen painting, right? It's like, what? What is this software doing? And so these were different points in this design space. So a couple of notes about these agreements. So the first is that we're augmenting and embellishing the actual agreement itself. Okay, we're not modifying the underlying content, we're just adding to it, right? And so we're adding content on the panels on the side, but we're also adding visual design on top of it. And so the result is we only have one document. We're still with one document, which doesn't split attention. Okay, so we're not adding new videos, we're not adding new documents to look at, we're not adding comics. We're working with this one particular document, and we think there are good reasons for this that I'll talk about in a minute. Now, I talked about this problem of desensitization and habituation to these things. And so how do we counter that? How do we think we can counter that? Well, we have things like the factoids, we have the pull quotes, we have vignettes, right, the little comics. These can be customized on a per application basis, so you can continually make these things fresh and new for every application. Now, inevitably I'm asked, well, what about the legality of these things? So you're really, tweaking the visual design of these agreements a lot. Is this going to be legal? So have you ever seen fine print in a document? So this is typographic manipulation where it's really trying to de-emphasize a particular point. This is legal, right? So fine print is legal. These particular techniques are likely to be legal. Of course, you don't know until you have a court case and some judge decides upon it. But all the opinions we've gotten so far indicates that these are not going to affect the legality of the document. If anything, they'll help your case. So we have these redesigns. The natural question is, do they work? So we designed a between subjects experimental study. We invited people in. We asked them, their particular task was, we asked them to download 3 different pieces of software and then choose one most appropriate for this image manipulation task. So we're saying, evaluate these three pieces of software. Tell us which one that you would use in the long term, right? So we didn't tell them anything about our true intent of monitoring how they were going to react to the license agreements themselves. Okay, so it was a deception study. After they completed the study, then we told them, yeah, actually, we didn't care about the usability of, your overall rating of these applications. We really were, measuring how much time you spent on the license agreements and things like scrolling. We also had a post-task questionnaire that included a content quiz. So we had 5 different conditions. 4 of them are right here. So in the top left, we have your typical text-based agreement. So that's our control. Now in the top right, we have another sort of control condition. So in this particular condition, we just threw graphics up there. We call this the PowerPoint fluff version, right? So we just put pink circles and arrows and that kind of stuff, just to see would it be enough to have the visual graphics on there to get people's attention, or did we need to have more principled application of the techniques that we talked about. On the bottom left is a moderate application of the techniques, and on the bottom right is just the over-the-top heavy application that I showed you earlier. Our 5th condition, we had a summary condition. So when you first start up the installer, then you had a 1-page summary of the contents of the agreement. Okay. You also had the full agreement later on, but this was a condition to test out this assumption that, or this question of whether these 1-page summaries are effective. Okay. We had 84 participants, about 17 per condition, about half male, half female. So the age range was 17 to 47, mean age of 24. And we gave them a $10 Tim Hortons gift certificate, which we find Tim Hortons gift certificates are more of a draw than just $10 cash. And I don't know why. This is the current thinking right now around Waterloo. Okay, so what do we find? Well, we found that our agreements do make a difference. So on the left, you see the heavy and moderate conditions, and then you see the minimal condition followed by summary and control. So in the control condition, where you had straight up text, people spent an average of 7 seconds on that screen. Now that includes the time to navigate to the accept button to click it, and then the time spent to click next, right? So they're not reading these things at all, right? They're clicking accept, next, done, okay? We raised the mean reading time by 30 seconds. Okay, which is pretty significant when you're going from 0, right? It's this is not enough time to read the entire agreement, but it's a very significant result in this particular context. We also asked subjects to rate how much they read of the agreements, and so again, same arrangement. You can see heavy and moderate are higher on average. We got statistical significance with the moderate application of the techniques. Look at the summary technique. It's pretty much at the bottom, and we'll come back to that in a second. But the important thing here is that people are reporting that they're reading the agreements more. Now, we had a content quiz, and in this particular study, the results weren't conclusive. So we did have a higher mean in terms of the scores for the content quiz, but the reason why we think it's inconclusive is we made an extremely difficult quiz for them to perform. So we had 3 different agreements, potential agreements that they could read. Right, so 3 different applications, 3 different agreements. We asked them to pair terms from the agreements with the actual agreement that the term was found in, with some distractors in there, right? So they could choose any of the 3 agreements or none of the agreements. So it was a very difficult task. And on top of that, their primary task, they thought what their primary task was to evaluate the software. And so there was no motivation on their part to spend the time to commit the terms to long-term memory. And so we're going to change our study design a bit to probe this a bit further, because all evidence points to these things working. And so we're going to revisit this notion of comprehension in a future study. In terms of visual appeal, people rated these as significantly more visual appealing than the control condition. You kind of, expect this when you look at just straight up text compared to someone taking time and effort to redesign the agreements. And then finally, we got a number of comments like this. So it got me to read them. When I install other programs, I never read them. Big letters, organized points, and cartoons help. I think the organization was most important, right? So these techniques were working. Now, importantly, again, our heavy and moderate application of the techniques were having effects, but the minimal condition, where we had the PowerPoint fluff graphics, was not having a significant effect across these different dimensions. So I talked about summaries. So we had this one-page summary, and I bring this up because a lot of people have advocated using summaries to make these things more manageable. So we found that people did spend time, a significant amount of time, reading the summaries, right? So that's good. But when you look at the full agreement, we have significantly less scrolling of the agreement. So that's the top chart up there. So they're not scrolling through the agreement in the summary, the full agreement in the summary condition. They're not spending time. So that's the middle graph right there. They're not spending time in the full agreement. Their time is being invested in the summary. And so what's happening is these summaries are short-circuiting them reading or even considering the full consent agreement, right? So while they're working on by themselves, people are reading them, it's causing them to avoid looking at the full agreement. Now this is, somewhat, I don't know if you want to call it dangerous, but it's definitely something where you want to stop and consider, do you want to use this if you actually want people to read the agreements and make a legally binding agreement? Because there's an assumption being made on the user's part that every bit of information that's relevant to them is in the summary, when in fact there might be terms and conditions in the full agreement that are more applicable to them or more relevant to them, right? And so you're making a choice of what content you're going to show in the summary, but what that means is that the user is expecting that anything that they need to know or everything they need to know is in that summary. And so this, again, sort of cautions against their use. All right, so the take-home messages. So one, visual design can make a real difference in compelling people to read these really boring, dry legal documents, right? By spending time to design them and improve their presentation, right? People are going to think that, hey, this is important to me. They're trying to get my attention. They think this is important. I'm going to spend time reading it. Now, we talked about a couple different techniques, like ways to solve this problem, and one of them was, maybe require people to scroll through before they click the accept button. Okay, this is an example of providing or of giving them a task to perform that's separate from the task of reading the agreement, right? And we think this is, in the long run, we haven't been able to study this yet, but we think in the long run this is going to be deleterious to the process, because when you get to that consent screen or that license agreement screen, right, and you see that the accept button is grayed out, your new task becomes, how do I enable that thing, right? Your task is not, how can I read this? It's, how do I get this thing enabled? Oh, I have to go and scroll through. Okay, done. Accept, next. Okay, and so we don't think it's especially good to give people these artificial tasks to perform to compel them to read. Instead, show them it's worth their time, right? Generate intrinsic motivation to read the agreements themselves. And then again, we think that from the summary data we collected, that when you bring in these auxiliary documents, whether they're extra videos, extra documents, or extra content, this has the potential to split people's attention and pull them away from the full agreement. So if you really want them to focus on the contents of the full agreement, we think the best approach is to work on that particular document itself, work in that space, so you're not dividing people's attention. All right. So some future work. So we have promising results. We want to further understand these techniques, which ones have the most effect, whether we need to use them in concert with one another. We have some intuitions. We just don't have hard data yet to turn this into a complete model to generate these things. We're also starting to look at some new interaction techniques. I'll show you some example mock-ups in a second. And then Matt has just started some work that's really interesting in automatically generating these agreements. And so, given content that's marked up, he's looking at ways to spit out an agreement automatically to reduce the load on the designer to produce these. We're also obviously very interested in deploying these in software and services outside of ingimp. So right now it's really embedded with our own project. So if you guys know any companies that have high traffic, software services out there where people are compelled to, where the company is compelled to reach their users, let us know, because we'd love to get these into practice and run more tests very quickly to understand what elements of the design are going to make a big difference. Okay, so some examples that we're looking at right now. So right here, this is an example where we're starting to augment the document. We're starting to label aspects of it that according to the type of content in there. So we're taking these warning boxes that we had in our original document, and then we're augmenting the scroll bar to show where these things are in the document. So we provide a summary saying, okay, there are X number of important warnings, X info boxes, not summarizing the content, but summarizing the type of content to compel people again to scroll through and actually look at the document. And so you can imagine as you scroll down, when you hit one of these warning boxes, you can imagine providing additional information, for example, perhaps here in the footer, to again make it a bit more interactive and play with the unique capabilities of the computer compared to just a static paper-based document. Another example right here. So this, I call this the like the pop-up video technique. I don't know if we have a name for it yet, but the idea is as you're scrolling through it, you get these little pop-ups next to the content to again add interest to the document and to compel people to explore the document to see what else is in there. And so you can imagine as a point comes up, we pop up a vignette, and then as you scroll on, another pop-up comes up with some more information. So again, techniques to try to help compel people to move through the document and see what content it has. All right, so I'd like to acknowledge our funding sources. So we've a lot of this work has been supported through grants from NSERC, so NSERC Discovery Grant, USRA, and then PGSM. There are email addresses and URLs for the projects. I'd be happy to take any questions. You guys have been kind of quiet, but hit me up with questions. Yeah.
So I think there's probably at least a few different classes of users. There's probably the user who doesn't really care at all, doesn't even know what a license agreement is. There's probably the user that most of us belong to that kind of do care but can be bothered to read it anyway. And there's the user who does care and does read every single letter. Do you have any information about how many people are in each of those classes? And I think that would sort of cap the effectiveness of any techniques that you do to make these better on how many people you actually affect.
So I don't have numbers in terms of the different classes or categories. Matt's got a comment.
Yeah. Well, we do kind of have numbers because we have the self-reporting information on how much people indicate they normally read agreements. So that that 2% number that he was pulling out there is actually found in some other previous work by some other people and then replicated in our own study. That's sort of the class of people who say I read them regularly, and then I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head. Maybe about 20% of people say they read them often, and then everyone else sort of falls into the like rarely to never. Of course, those are self-reported numbers, so you don't know exactly how accurate they are. But one of the things with the idea of sort of capping this, that could be true. I mean, most of the increase in reading times that we have are in sort of those top two categories that I mentioned. There is actually a very strong correlation between the classes that people were in and whether or not they had improvement. But there was actually improvement in those classes. So it's not like we're helping only sort of people at the low end and not helping people who normally read them. We are helping people who normally read them as well.
So to build on that, we were very conscious of the fact that different people have different needs, and so we tried to. If you recall, I mentioned that we tried to employ this notion of information layering. right? Where you have, your most critical points very obvious, and you have these different levels of presenting the information, right? And so our design was intended to work across the spectrum, where if you're this type of person who never reads them, things like the pull quotes, right, the factoids, might draw you in, where in other situations, there's no hope. Question in the back.
Actually, sorry. Actually, just sort of building on that question, I was wondering about the results of the study of showing the more engagement with the introduction of the new techniques.
Okay.
And I was thinking maybe did you consider whether it could also be caused, or would it be worth studying whether that's because of the novelty of the presentation? I mean, this is the first time we've ever seen a legal agreement with some of these novel presentations. Like, could you measure whether, wait a minute, they're just looking at it because it's novel, and then if they are presented with the same thing a number of times, they would just start, passing through the same as before?
So the condition on the top right was to control for that, right? And so that condition was just like, this does not look like your typical license agreement, right? We have some graphics up there. We do have some minimal design, visual design to the agreement. That right there was not producing any effect.
So I agree with that, but at the same time, it still looks familiar to people, right? It's like people have seen PowerPoint presentations before, and then once they just figure out, oh, it's a legal agreement plus a PowerPoint presentation, they just figured out that's what you're doing. Maybe they pass through, or I don't know. I'm just wondering.
I don't know. I mean, when we were doing the qualitative studies, right, when we had stuff that confused people or they mistook it for something else, it didn't stop them. I mean, they blasted right through it, right? When we had like flashy graphics, people were saying, well, is this like a tutorial? What is this? I don't care. I'm going to get through it, right? And so, I mean, I think the thing to consider is that you're going to have a continuum right here, and maybe the one on the top right has some effect, but it was just simply not at the degree of effect that we were seeing with the other agreements. But this gets to the point of what's going to happen when you have these things deployed in lots of applications and people are encountering them. We don't know. We haven't had the luxury of having thousands of people looking at these things repeatedly. But again, I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that our particular techniques are resulting in people actually stopping and spending the time. One of the things that we noticed with the qualitative comments, so when people talked about the bottom two ones, the moderate heavy application, they mentioned things like organization, the fact that they could easily navigate through the content and so on, whereas those types of comments were not found in the one on the top right. So I think there's again some evidence that these techniques have to be, techniques like the factoids, techniques like the vignettes have to be added in. It's not enough to have graphics on there. The other thing to keep in mind that I don't think I emphasized is that every embellishment that we have in the moderate and heavy condition is intended to complement the content right next to it. So for example, we have these factoids, but they're strategically placed, okay? And we're trying to accomplish something we call attention piggybacking, where that element grabs your attention, and then you're sort of intrigued, and then you go over and read the actual text. Okay. Whereas the graphics in the top right, they're randomly placed. They're not strategically placed to enhance the actual content. And so I think that is one of the major differences between these conditions.
When I go to the hardware store to buy a product, okay, in a glance, I can look at the hazard signs, and I know that the product is explosive, corrosive, or whatever. Why don't we have official logos that tell you what is in the license agreement, rather than, what are the main aspects of the agreement?
Right. So this is kind of like the Creative Commons approach, where they have the different emblems, right? I think the reason is that the terms vary widely, right? And we're talking about agreements that range from 2,000 words on up, right? And so the GPL, for example, it takes about 20 minutes to go and read through that, right? And so they might be able to be mixed in, but I don't think they're going to replace the need to be able to go through the content and actually read the terms. I don't think the terms of the license agreements are so so general, are so what's the word? So common in practice that you could actually do that. I think Matt has another comment to.
So there's like the P3P project, Platform for Privacy Preferences, which is attempting to essentially encode terms in license agreements in a machine-readable format, so then another application can allow people to set their preferences and then go, oh, you know, this is against whatever preferences you set. One of the problems that that project has come up against is that the terms in various agreements are very ambiguous, and it's very difficult for them to categorize them to actually make it possible to build an application like this.
Yeah, it just becomes hard to bin everything into one particular category.
On the other hand, if you want to better communicate a license agreement, and nobody will really read those 20 pages when you install a software, you need to find standards saying, well, those 3 paragraphs, they appear in every license agreement, and they should be common to every software.
So I mentioned we're looking at automation approaches, and one of the things that we want to do is build a corpus of these things so that you can start to intelligently parse them out, right? And so the tool can help you flag stuff that is unusual. But I don't think it's that easy of a task.
Okay. Just another short question unrelated. I work in a company where basically we realized we needed a license agreement 6 hours before we launched the software. So suppose that in my software I would like to have those cartoons and all that. Do you know how you could automatize it or?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, Matt is working on techniques to automate the production of these things. We also have some templates available that are on the web where it can help structure the creation of these.
Okay.
Yeah, this guy's been waiting.
Do you have enough users downloading ingimp that you could run live experiments on them?
Yes and no. So we are actually doing this. So what really got us into this particular work is that, or this particular research problem is that we had a sizable enough user base that we had more non-native English speakers of ingimp than native English speakers, right? And we have this very lengthy consent agreement that's all in English. And so, you know, we asked ourselves, could we take this and then create wordless diagrams so that we could convey the concepts and not worry about localization? We did that. We threw it into ingimp, and then we randomized whether that would appear or not. And what we found is that there was kind of like this novelty effect where people would look at a few of these things, but then they would skip through them and ignore the rest. And so that changed our course to really investigate this problem of how do we capture and then retain attention. So we can do this, but we need to have like regular release cycles to continue to stoke interest and to get people to download it and go through the license agreement. And we haven't released, I think, for about a year.
So is there anything that...
Yep, go ahead. From California. Just to come back to the point that was raised earlier about icons and also P3P. So for the icons, there have actually been a couple of attempts at that. Most notably, the trustee privacy seals. Back in the beginning, before trustee really got launched, that was what they were trying to do. They got pushback from industry. Nobody was interested in having those little icons. And if industry won't sign on for it, it makes it very difficult to get adoption. As for P3P, there are a number of pros and cons. The idea that there's ambiguity in the policy doesn't particularly make it harder to author the P3P policies because they're authored by the people who understand what those answers are, right? They're authored by the companies. They know the actual answers. It would be hard for an outsider to code their policy for them. But the companies themselves already have those answers. So the question is, do the companies want to eliminate that ambiguity? And that's going to be an adoption problem for P3P and has been. Companies like hiding behind that. There's been some great work on, there was a paper that came out called What's Wrong with Privacy Policies that looked at deliberate ambiguity and hedging claims and how many companies use things to minimize problems. That's over in the privacy policy world, which is a little bit different from this, but pretty similar. So that ambiguity is actually on purpose in a lot of cases.
All right. Thanks. Is there another question? Yeah. Okay.
I do too.
Go ahead.
Oh,
California. Okay, so the question is, you guys were looking for licenses that are in use, and originally this was promoted as an open source sort of licensing, and ingimp was the example of it, how you're collecting information. So the Free Software Foundation, last time I heard, they had something like 63 different licenses, and I'm sure there's a lot more than that. If you take a look across like SourceForge, there's a huge variety of licenses that are there. Have you guys looked at any of those and sort of why people, not only why they can't get something common ground on more of those licenses, but also how, just in general, how to make those particular licenses more usable to the users?
Right. So we had we've actually talked with this one fellow who used to work for the Free Software Foundation, and there seems to be some interest, potential interest in applying this to the GPL, but we haven't looked at this much larger problem that you mentioned of all the different licenses and trying to categorize and tag them. I think it's a slightly different, though related problem to what we're looking at. So right now we're just really focused on capturing people's attention and how we can best communicate once you're in the license agreement. Hopefully the techniques will be generalizable to all those different types of licenses. But no, we haven't looked too much in detail at all the different open source licenses out there.
Okay, thank you.
Any other question in the remote offices? All right, then I'll also ask a question. So could there be a problem with this legal agreement that the agreements are written in both a legal language and also technical language? Like if a legal agreement talks about cookies and about logs, many of the users might not even understand what these legal agreements are talking about. So even if they read, even if they're annotated, they will say like, okay, so this cookie is stored. Okay, so what's this cookie?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And actually, I can fold that into the last question a bit. So when we were looking at the GPL and how we might augment that, the fellow we were talking with who used to work at the Free Software Foundation mentioned that a lot of people claim they understand the terms of the GPL, but when you talk to them, it's obvious that they have misconceptions about it, right? And so there's this, FAQ associated with the license that helps to explain some of these terms. And so, understanding the terms of the agreement is itself sort of a challenge. And so this partially motivated this design that we are playing with right now. When you reach certain sections of the agreement, you can augment it with information like frequently asked questions, right? And that might be another great place for these pop-ups to come in to help aid comprehension of these terms that people might not be familiar with.
Okay, and a second question. So some of this, can you go to the previous example? That was, okay, so in this example, the company or whoever created the software decides that that's very important for the user, that particular section. But,
yep.
But maybe in fact the user doesn't really care about that part, but cares maybe about another part, which now will be more or less hidden because it's less emphasized.
Right.
Is it possible that different users might care about different things in the particular log policy, and the company thinks, well, the user should be really concerned about this, but maybe the user is not really concerned about that?
Right. So, this is a question of how do you apply these techniques given all the agreements? Which ones are you going to highlight and which ones are you going to...
Or even to different users. Maybe different users care about different particular policies.
So this is why we're interested in more of a data-driven approach, where we build a corpus of not only of these agreements, but the types of terms that set people off, right? And so if we can build a model of which clauses and agreements people find most significant, that's one step forward to addressing this problem. The next obvious step is to build individual user models, right? And so that you can have these techniques emphasize the content on a per user basis, right? But that's that's a bit further in the future than we're dealing with right now.
Thank you.
I think Matt had some comments.
I just had a quick comment about the sort of the language issue. There are also sort of groups that are looking at this. There's a group of lawyers, an international association called the Plain Language Association, which is basically looking to try to move people towards using simpler English that doesn't require basically a college level or greater education in order to understand. So there are people working on that aspect of the problem as well.
More questions from the remote offices? Anyone locally? No? Okay, well, thank you very much.
All right, thanks. Appreciate it.